Viewers of my channel, Lifting the Veil, going to be having a chat with Mike the Vegan on YouTube.
Hello.
I really respect what he does. His videos are really informative. He's one of my go-to channels for as far as health and nutrition information goes. My favorite thing that he does is he does this series called Diet Debunked, which is basically destroying the illusions of so many popular myths in the health and nutrition community, especially things like the supplements industry, things like fad diets such as blood type diet, things regarding saturated fats, and other major controversies that are going on in the health and nutrition field. And for my viewers, for you guys who may be new to my channel, the most important thing that I've come across as far as health and nutrition is biomagnification, bioaccumulation. And it's something that is highly important for everyone to understand. It's a major aspect of science and environmental health issues, but nobody really understands how important it is and how it really impacts us in our day-to-day lives, not just from things like household pollutants, but things that involve environmental pollutants coming directly into our bodies through what we're eating, diet and nutrition.
Okay, well, you've probably heard of some chemicals like dioxin and PCBs, and they fall into that category of persistent organic pollutants. And basically, most of these are industrial contaminants that essentially, they sort of end up being just released into the atmosphere from, smokestacks, things like that, manufacturing. And then they end up in the water supply. They end up in just kind of like a low kind of particle dust level, basically everywhere, especially around areas with larger levels of manufacturing. And so what happens is, it ends up into the water, for example, and then it bioaccumulates to the plankton and then the fish and then other animals. And so we see, for example, that about, 80 million times bioaccumulation occurs between the water and maybe like a large sea mammal, and it's almost that high in just like your generic fish. And so these are chemicals that are very harmful. A lot of them, as you mentioned, are endocrine disruptors, so they're screwing with your hormones, and this has so many effects on so many diseases, especially diseases like diabetes. And that's sort of the study, which hopefully you can link, mentions that about 95% of persistent organic pollutants come from animal fat. That's because they're stored in fat, they're stored in our fat, and so, eating a standard American diet, especially, you're just going to be dumping these into your body. And so, it's not just fish, it's other things as well. This bioaccumulates through feed, and we also have interesting just factory farming sort of processes that occur, which are just really bad. Like, for example, we'll take fish and we'll grind up like the extra fish, and then we'll put it in the animal feed because, what else are you going to do with it? And then they'll feed it to the cows or whatever, and then they will spray that manure on the field, and so then it ends up in, more of the crops, and then they eat that as well. And we get these crazy cycles of bioaccumulation of these toxins.
Conflicts between the fish meal industry and the local people. Besides the fact that the industry exhausts the supply of small fish, which form a key part of the whole ecosystem, the factory's emissions pollute both the air and the water. Biologist Romulus Aquilar describes how the fish meal factories release untreated waste that destroys life on the ocean floor.
Y las fábricas no tratan los efluentes, de tal modo de que por el efluente va escamas, van trozos de pescado, van sanguaza, va el licor de prensa, y todo va a parar directamente al lado abierto.
Maria Elena Forondo Faro has fought against the fish meal industry in Chimbote for decades. She was imprisoned for her work, but released with the help of Amnesty International.
Y están generando problemas de contaminación, impactos en la salud de los niños, problemas respiratorios, problemas alérgicos en la piel. Es una industria que no piensa en el futuro, que piensa solamente en el lucro personal y no en el desarrollo de esta ciudad.
Sugar prawns and farmed salmon are inexpensive to buy in stores because someone else has already paid the real price.
And, you know, another very important thing to mention is the obesogen aspect. The idea that since these are endocrine disruptors, they can, for example, end up boosting your estrogen and things like that and fat storage. And there was one study that was done on some rats, and I normally don't, I don't support these types of studies, but they took over 6 months, they took rats that were just fed normal food and rats that were fed some of these obesogenic toxins, and the same amount of calories, and the ones that were fed the toxins ended up with 36% more body fat than the ones that weren't exposed to the chemicals. And so there's these crazy just processes in our body that get completely messed up through this, and it's just totally messed up. And diabetes, for example, those with the highest levels of pollutants in their blood had 38 times the odds of diabetes, and that's from the same study I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's insane, especially the amount, the sheer scale of the magnification. This accumulates by orders of magnitude as it goes just one level up the food chain. So this is one of the main things why I like to drill this into people, is that every time I talk about pesticides and toxins in the environment and in our food, everyone's aware of how harmful processed foods are, and as well as, everyone's aware of how harmful factory farming is as well. But whenever I talk about pollutants, environmental toxins, and things like that, a lot of times I also get people, warning how dangerous. Well, plants have pesticides. Plants have a lot of toxins on them as well, and a lot of pollutants in the soil. The main factor of that is that in order to limit our exposure to environmental toxins, the best way to do that is to eat the lowest on the food chain that we possibly can, which is plants, the plant kingdom. Because each level of magnitude that you're eating higher than that, you are magnifying these environmental toxins by serious orders of magnitude, by millions. You mentioned, what is it, 80 to 100 million times the magnification level?
Well, let's review the chart. You can show this chart in your video. We see water in terms of milligrams, or concentration of PCBs in milligrams per liter or milligrams per kilogram of body fat when they get to the animals. Seawater starts at 0.000002, and then things like phytoplankton end up at 8, and then you go up to invertebrates like starfish, and you're up at 5 or 11, and fishes 1 to 37. I mean, 37 compared to 0.000002. And then marine mammals again, up to like 160. So it's just crazy. They say the general rule is every layer you go up on the food chain is about 10 times the concentration. But you can see here, it's a little bit unpredictable, and it's just completely crazy. It's just you never know what you're getting, basically.
Yeah. So again, just to clarify for everyone, that these are both fat soluble and water soluble toxins in the environment. And so for fat soluble, it's stored in the fat cells or in the tissue cells of these animals, basically in all life forms. Everyone is, again, whenever we talk about this, at least when I talk about this on my social media platforms, everyone is so concerned about the exogenous hormones, or in other words, the added hormones to things like beef and cattle and things like that. But I always, drive the message home that all animals have hormones. I mean, animals require hormones to live, and so it doesn't matter what we're adding into these animals, although that has a huge factor to it. But regardless of any added antibiotic shots or any added vaccines into these animals, or anything added that we do to these animals already have these accumulated in their system, things like fat-soluble toxins as well as the water-soluble toxins as well. Although water-soluble toxins can be more readily excreted out of the body and detoxified out of the body through natural processes using the liver and the kidneys and our internal organs. But the fat-soluble toxins are obviously stored in the fat cells, which involves also intramyocellular lipids, which, as you were mentioning, incorporates highly into diabetes, which is a major factor as well. And since we're on the topic of discussing the oceans and the waterways, so a lot of these toxins, these come from things like these are industrial chemicals. Let's talk about briefly which specific chemicals that we're talking about. Things like dioxins, we got BPA, bisphenol A, a product of plastic
Or
production.
PCBs, yeah. We got PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls.
There you go.
Yeah, again, this is another endocrine disruptor. We're looking at various carcinogens. We're looking at, things that some have bromine in them, which is, a carcinogen as well. And they're just generally toxic things. I mean, they're things you don't want in your body. And so, and they're everywhere, things that would come off of, like some type of chemical plant or through the refining of oil and things like that. And they're in the air too, but, mainly they make it through water. And the health effects are pretty crazy. I mean, again, think about how that 36% extra fat, if your body storing over 30% more fat just from a toxin, that's crazy. And that was that they gave some pregnant mice and found another, in another study how that it made them more fat was tributyltin, and that's just another thing that bioaccumulates in seafood. There's studies showing that it's higher in like shrimp and crabs, and there's just so many chemicals out there involved in all of our modern industrial processes, and there's just the more sources you get these bioaccumulated toxins from, the worse you're going to be off, no matter what. And it can mess with all sorts of growth hormones, and of course, just estrogen in general, and fat is just, most people are trying to lose weight, at least in the US, so.
Mm-hmm.
That's one.
Yeah, exactly.
The endocrine disrupting industrial toxins in fish don't just affect our gonads, but other glands too, like getting thyroid disruption from the flame retardant chemicals, which literally just settle out of the atmosphere such that even fish who only swim around Antarctica are contaminated. Levels in the United States, though, are higher than anywhere else in the world. Researchers recently looked at U.S. retail salmon. And where do you think they found the most contamination? 6 choices: wild caught with skin, wild caught without skin, organically farmed salmon with or without skin, or conventionally farmed salmon with skin or without. The differences were really marginal, but the worst? Organic farmed salmon with skin. The wild caught was least contaminated. Note also that it didn't really seem to matter much whether you took off the skin, which suggests that the toxins are actually concentrated into the fish muscle itself. PBDEs aren't the only new industrial toxin we're finding in fish. This year, researchers looked at the amount of polychlorinated naphthalenes in fat that was sucked out of the butts of New Yorkers in liposuction samples. Where in the diet was it coming from? Out of about 52 daily nanograms, 50 came from fish. What's the bottom line? Until safer and more renewable sources of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, plant-based sources, become more generally available, it would seem responsible for physicians to refrain from advocating that people should increase their intake through fish. But it is available now. There are 6 brands of microalgae-derived DHA on the market now. I just showed this one because I found it to be the cheapest. And it's 100% bioequivalent to what's in fish, a safe and convenient source, and less likely to go rancid than fish oil. As you can see on the little handout that came with this DVD, I recommend people take about 250 milligrams of microalgae-based DHA every day, which is about 5 times the average American intake.
Okay, so in the seafood, most people have no idea, but you and I both are well aware things that specifically the toxin BMAA is concentrated in. It's a cyanobacteria. It's a neurotoxin produced by the cyanobacteria. So in other words, the green algae that's found in the ocean, or is it blue-green algae?
The cyanobacteria. Yeah.
On his first day of life, an infant is hospitalized with seizures. The researchers concluded that his mother's daily spirulina use, starting in the 4th month of pregnancy, was likely to blame. I've talked previously about the liver and nerve toxins present in many spirulina supplements, but the supplement companies swear up and down the spirulina doesn't produce these toxins. And they may be right. But if spirulina doesn't produce toxins, how is it that toxins have repeatedly been found in spirulina supplements? It appears to be contamination of spirulina with toxin-producing blue-green algae. So, for example, if you look at the new U.S. Pharmacopoeia safety evaluation of spirulina, they conclude that the available evidence does not indicate a serious risk or other public health concern when spirulina is properly identified, formulated, and used. But that's the catch. You collect spirulina in some open lake, and you have no idea what other algae are going to crop up. The researchers report all sorts of adverse reactions in people taking spirulina products, but they attribute these issues to non-spirulina algae toxin contaminants within spirulina supplements, known to be toxic to the liver and cancer-causing. So unless there's third-party testing of each batch, with which no company could presumably afford to do, I continue to encourage people to avoid spirulina products.
It's called beta-methylamino L-alanine, and it's basically believed to be the sole cause of this ALS outbreak in Guam a while back. They had 100 times the incidence of ALS as the rest of the world, and they basically traced it back to they were killing these flying foxes like crazy, and the flying foxes were eating these cycad nuts, and the cycads were growing in this cyanobacteria-rich sort of watery soil. So, like, for example, the cyanobacteria level was 72 micrograms per gram. The cycads were, they went up a bit, and then the flying foxes were even higher. The free levels of BMAA were just exorbitant, like 3,556 milligrams per gram, and then the people, in their brains and they're bonded to their proteins was about 627 micrograms per gram. So you can just see this high level of this toxin, which you can induce ALS-like symptoms in monkeys. Again, a super cruel thing to do, but it just goes to show. There's also studies showing that they actually fry your motor neurons, and that is exactly what is happening in ALS. Is your motor neurons are just like dying, and so that's a huge one. And that's a study which you can also link. So basically, it's not just these cycad nuts and these these flying foxes. It's actually in just normal seafood. We can find studies where the levels are very comparable to these flying foxes in blue crabs, and also various shrimp, different areas. It depends, and this is all connected to the algae blooms. We're throwing 39 billion humans worth of solid waste in the US into the Gulf of Mexico from animal agriculture, and then we've got all of the chemical runoff, and that's just creating these blooms. So one of the major causes of this is just shit. We got 39 billion humans worth of crap going down into the Gulf of Mexico and all around the US because animal agriculture just totaling up all the poop. It was from Senator Tom Harkin's official report. It was 39 billion, 5.5 times the population of Earth worth of solid waste coming from animal agriculture. And that's really high nitrogen, really high phosphorus. All of that in combination with all the chemical fertilizers going down the Mississippi, etc., creates algae blooms, which means a ton of that cyanobacteria making a bunch of that BMAA neurotoxin, And then so we have studies off the coast of Florida, right there in the Gulf of Mexico, showing that, you know, things like shrimp and crab, animals like shrimp and crab can have the same levels of BMAA as those flying foxes in Guam that were literally inducing ALS. And so basically we've got this big ALS bomb wherever we have these algae blooms. So it's pretty horrible, and no one really talks about it. You know, I saw even it's obscure enough that there's a guy making a documentary about it, and I don't know if he ever was able to get funding, even because it was, you know, it's just like a little too obscure, and the ALS is like a not very common disease. But, you know, just being exposed to neurotoxins like this, it's bad. And then just as a sort of indicator for, you know, how easily we can be accumulating these toxins up, you know, the food chain, it's pretty astounding.
Well, that's definitely a very shitty matter. In my perspective, this would definitely affect fresh waterways, for example, like the Chesapeake Bay, Hudson Bay, these smaller waterways a lot more easily than it would be to things like open harbors, open bays, things that have access to a lot more water circulation.
And the Chesapeake Bay is actually an ALS cluster. You know, people are eating this blue crab all the time, and they're basically just eating BMAA, depending on, you know, what time of the year it is when the crab was caught, and how much crap was dumped into the waterway at that given cycle.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's specifically the blue crab, which is a fresh and as well as saltwater crab as well. But, you know, we're not talking about things like Alaskan king crab, although in the Pacific waterways, we have a whole different factor with that, which is the Fukushima radiation and things like that. So that would probably also be a huge factor to consider as well.
Absolutely. And we don't know if you're buying fish in the store, can you even know if it came from radiation, containing waters? We don't really know. And basically that's why one of the many reasons I just don't eat fish.
Yeah, exactly. So it's best to eliminate our exposure to these extreme sources of bioaccumulated toxins as much as we can. I mean, that's the best we can do. So also about specifically the Pacific waterways or even Atlantic waterways, one of the most popular, you know, sources of meat would be tuna. And again, I remember I saw not too long ago from Dr. Greger on nutritionfacts.com he mentioned that I forget which study it is, I'll have to go back and look that up and link it later on, but just the equivalent of 1 can of tuna fish per week was the equivalent of up to 100 vaccinations worth of the levels of mercury that we're exposing ourselves to. So literally just 1 can of tuna is equivalent to massive extreme doses of vaccination levels of mercury, which is...
Yeah, it really puts it into perspective there.
I mean, that's huge for so many, especially for my audience, for my viewers who are much more conspiratorial minded. We're very conscious of what we're doing to specifically our children, you know, through things like vaccination and things like that. But we're completely unaware of this far more concentrated source, which is through tuna fish or fish in general, because we know, or seafood in general, not even seafood, but even just any type of marine food, whether it's freshwater or saltwater.
Totally. I would say if you're afraid of mercury in vaccines, then you should be shitting your pants about mercury in fish, because you just got to look at the numbers sometimes, and it's out of control.
Yeah, exactly. And then not even to mention the pathogen aspect of things like specifically raw fish. I mean, the most popular consumption of fish would be raw fish.
There's a parasitic worm in fish called Anisakis. This year, we learned that about 2/3 of retail fish samples came up positive for them. This is what they look like. They're really quite small, actually. You can see 2 here kind of peeking out of some sushi. Because people eat fish raw, parasites are always a concern. But the unique thing about these worms is that our bodies can be so sensitive to them that the worms can trigger an allergic reaction dead or alive, even if they're cooked. So we're finding some people that are allergic to fish really aren't. They're allergic to the dead worms in the fish. In fact, because we feed so much fish meal to chickens, you can have an allergic reaction to a parasitic fishworm and not even eat fish at all.
So things like sushi. So of course, and then I remember seeing studies about the sources of the sushi is just a huge corruption. There's like
there's just mislabeling across the entire, especially these sushi restaurants, very, very high levels of mislabeling depending on the city. And so you can think you're eating a low mercury fish and just go and be eating like the highest mercury fish. And so it's just another reason to stay away from fish.
And then I forget where I saw it, whether it was one of your videos or someone else's video, but that the fact that even in some of they tested even in the highest quality sushi restaurants, like literally 5-star sushi restaurants, and they were freaking feeding them like just, it wasn't even the actual type of fish that it was supposed to be, that it was labeled. So again, the mislabeling is, I mean, it's and how would you possibly, I mean, of course you can really know what type of fish you're getting, but the best way is to, I mean, do we really need it? Is it necessary? I mean, do we really need raw fish? I mean, you got to get your omega-3s from the fish oil, right?
The contaminants I've been talking about are just from how polluted our planet has become. It's not like they're deliberately adding them to fish. But fish farmers do feed about 24 human antibiotics to their fish to keep them alive in such stressful, overcrowded environments. They also had to figure out a way to make grayish fish flesh look pink, which it is naturally when pulled out of the ocean. So the aquaculture industry feeds farmed fish artificial coloring. This is from the drug company Roche. Fish farmers get to pick out the color they want to dye their flesh like paint chips. The possible human health consequences? You can get a rare condition called gold dust retinopathy. You like gold dust. As the coloring potentially crystallizes in the back of our eyeballs, which can lead to problems down the road.
Yeah, fish oil is another way that we bioaccumulate toxins. Again, we're talking about the 95% of these persistent organic pollutants being in animal fat. You're literally taking a pill of animal fat, and so it's pretty sketchy. And going back to the idea of requiring fish, though, we have the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the largest organization of nutrition professionals in the world, and they say you don't need to eat fish. You don't require it. You can get the omegas that you need for all stages of life from plants. And so, looking at all, the largest organization of experts, and, that combined with all the pollutants it's a good idea to stay away from fish. If you're really worried about getting enough DHA, you can take algae-based DHA, which is way, way, way lower on the food chain. That's where the fish get it. Fish are bioaccumulating DHA from the algae along with all the toxins, so just go straight to the source there, I would say. I think just to summarize what we've been talking about, though, is essentially that there's this sort of, I don't even want to, it doesn't quite qualify as a conspiracy, but just something that people are just completely unaware of. Yeah, people get an idea there's maybe some mercury in some fish, like tuna, mercury, there's a connection there, but it goes so much deeper than that. Everything up the chain of agriculture, up to, how we're farming animals, it's all connected into, how toxic the Gulf of Mexico is. And trust me, the farmed fish are by no means less toxic. In fact, the average is more toxic because they're being fed, this feed that's sprayed. And so there's so many toxins that we don't even have time to talk about, list hundreds of toxins, pesticides and things that bioaccumulate as well, so yeah, it's just better to just stay away from anything like that can bioaccumulate,
Yeah, definitely. And again, we mostly covered the marine life, the marine sources of toxins. But again, obviously, this goes into the land. It goes into the land agriculture as well, because obviously every animal eats low on the food chain, but then it accumulates as we get higher and higher up into the food chain. So it's best. We don't even need the nutrition from from the third-party source, being the animal, we can get it directly from the source, which is the plants itself, which is the amino acids, the building blocks of nutrition. So we can get it directly from there rather than eating animal protein and animal fats, which harbor all of these harmful and damaging toxins, as well as whatever specific nutrients that they may have that may be beneficial to us. So most people don't consider their health and diet and nutrition as a whole, as a whole item. They don't weigh. An egg is a high source of protein, therefore it's a health food, right? What about all the negative aspects? What about all the toxic byproducts of all of these food products that we're putting in our bodies?
Absolutely. And speaking to the land statement, we didn't talk much about land, but I have a video on bone broth, and in it, I show a study where organic chickens still have a considerable amount of lead in their bones from bioaccumulating from eating chicken feed and stuff like that. These are organic. This is organic, and so it's just better,
and it could
eat it cleanly.
It can be free range as well, and humane.
Yeah.
And all of these other labeling marketing terms.
Exactly. You're not going to get grass-fed chicken too. So
yeah, exactly. And Dr. Greger also just did a recent series about lead toxicity, and again, it accumulating in our bones, and lead will bioaccumulate over it. There's no way to detoxify lead out of the body, so it will accumulate in the bones, and then you can also auto-intoxify yourself through the lead leaching out of your bones later on throughout your life. And most of this lead exposure that we've had was early on in our lives, especially for people who are older, since been around before the 70s, when lead toxicity was far more concentrated in our environment through the gasoline and everything. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to also throw that out there as well. So yeah, that basically covers everything that I believe I had off the top of my head that I wanted to cover. I think we covered everything that we wanted as well in the notes and in the studies. And again, I'll link description below. And where can we find more of your work, Mike?
Well, I've got my YouTube channel, Mike the Vegan, Mike like a microphone, M-I-C. My videos are all based off, all my claims are peer-reviewed research or the best sources available. You've got all the links in the description in case you're skeptical about what I'm saying, and so feel free to go check it out if you want. And yeah, I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you, Mike. I hope we can possibly do this again in the future regarding certain other controversial topics, maybe some topics regarding diet myths and nutrition myths as well, and again, of course, going through some of the peer-reviewed clinical research, so that way we're not going off of specific authors' claims or some random health blogs' claims, and that way we can observe some of the science and compare notes and see what the proper conclusion to come to about some of those things is.
Absolutely, sounds great. Yeah. If you're buying fish in the store, can you even know if it came, if it